talk about the different pieces of an NIH application. Now, this is more kind of focused on an R01 grant, but the pieces of the application are still pretty similar for K. It's just that there are pieces that are not research plan pieces you're going to have to be writing in relationship to your mentoring plan and this sort of stuff. And there's another one of these classes that's on the pieces of a grant that aren't the research plan pieces. And the mentoring plans and stuff is stuff I talk about then. And since you're not submitting until like a June deadline, that should be just fine. So the reason that I put it together this way is that I find that the different pieces of the research plan and who reads them and what they're for is often confusing to new investigators. And I'm actually the mentor of one of the MRDA folks this time. And as she's developing her proposal, it's very clear that it wasn't at all straightforward or clear to her what these different pieces were for and what the audiences are. And I think understanding that can kind of help you write them. Because in some ways, it almost seems like they're asking you to repeat your application 4 different places in 4 different ways, saying 4 different things. And if you understand that these pieces aren't read by the same people, it kind of makes more sense in the sense of how to target it. So for a K or an R award, pretty much all NIH grants have a project summary you have to write, a public health relevance, a specific aims page, and a research plan. And these are read and reviewed by different people and are used for different purposes. And that's why their tone and their formats are different. Okay, so the very first one is the project summary. Now, the thing about the project summary is that it's the only piece of the grant that is actually public information. So if you submit a grant and it's not funded, it just goes into the pits of the NIH to never to be seen again. But if it is funded, this is the publicly available description of your research. So and the readers of this project summary are a whole host of people. So you have to, depending on the kind of research, you want to be careful about how you word the project summary. That some of the readers are the research community. So I can, I will have another class on this, but there's a resource called NIH Reporter that allows you to look at every single grant funded by the NIH in the United States. The description of the research for that funding mechanism is this project summary. So if it's funded, everything you put in it is public knowledge, so that competitors and other people can read it and they will know what it says. Okay. It's also just like the general public. So the general public can be people like the press. It can be members of Congress or the congressional staffing. So the project summaries, you have to be careful that the way you state things and word things aren't going to maybe trigger the general public, which sometimes people don't pay a lot of attention to writing these, and they'll use key terms or say things in certain ways that might trigger, wasteful federal spending. Like for instance, let's say like in your case, you're working on a very clinical problem, but NIH funds things like on C. elegans roundworms, right? They're 800-cell worms. And that sometimes if the project summary is written in certain ways, people will say waste, fraud, and abuse. NIH is spending and wasting its money, supporting research on a worm. But if the project summaries are written in such a way to explain why the general public could care that research is being funded, you're not going to get targeted that way. But if they're worded in other ways, that could be targeted. Also, like if you're doing certain kinds of animal research, if you're putting too much detail in there, like PETA can target you. This actually happened to an investigator at our institution, that they were searching for things that um, seemed like extra problematic. And this investigator who studies early childhood trauma using rats got targeted because there was too much detail of the rat work in the project summary. Um, it also is study section members. So when you submit a grant and that you get scored and you get reviews, it's not at all unusual to have to submit twice. So you submit once, you get the feedback, you revise it, you submit it again. When you resubmit the grant, the project summary is the only piece of the prior application that the reviewers see. So um, again, there's strategies about how that project summary will look. And it's included, and also like for a K award, those aren't renewable, but if you have an R award that's renewable, the project summary is if you go in for a renewal, the project summary is what is the study section is going to judge you on in relationship to whether you did the aims of the prior project. Now, the format of this is a standard unstructured abstract. So it's basically about the length of an abstract. That generally, some things that I recommend is that I highly recommend that you use most of that space to describe the problem and emphasize why it is important. And this is because the audience is Congress, the audience is the general public. That definitely be very aware of describing anything that could be considered politically controversial or could look bad to the lay public. Again, you don't want to have your research summary, if somebody is naive or doesn't know stuff, to target you as a waste, fraud, and abuse for federal funding. And also, I recommend to keep the description of the work to be performed very vague. This is because that if you're doing something really innovative or whatnot, if you put too much description in the project summary, that gives the other people in the world to know exactly what you're working on and your approaches. And there are reasons that you might not want all the details of that to be public knowledge. That also, that again, this isn't for a K, but if you go into an R that is renewable, that the scope of work over a 4 to 5 year grant changes. And if you put the detailed what you're doing in your project summary too detailed, that you're almost asking the reviewers in your renewal to hold you to that exact scope of work. When you might have been very, very productive, but you took new opportunities, you have kind of switched the approach a little bit because of some data. So if it's sort of, it's descriptive, but you're not saying in specific aim one, I'm proposing to test a particular hypothesis or something. There's advantages to not doing that. And the thing about the project summary is that it's not pretty much ever read by the reviewers, except in the competing renewal situation or in a grant resubmission. It's not the piece that the reviewers are going to be looking at. It's generally not the piece that a lot of people at NIH program look at. So you can afford to be vague here without getting yourself into trouble. I've never known of a case where the project summary has been make or break for a grant. So these other considerations about not being detailed and really selling the importance of the work, there's a lot of advantages to that. Does that sort of make some sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. All right. So the next piece that you have to write is the public health relevance. Now, this is the other part of your grant that is posted publicly in the public databases. This is, again, your audience is the general public. This is where you really are selling, why NIH should be funding this work. In your case, I mean, your work is so clearly public health relevant. This should be a pretty easy thing for you to write. This tends to be more of a problem for basic scientists because basic scientists are also funded by the NIH. But the readers can be the research community, general public, the press, congressional staffers, NIH administrative staff. Now, these are only three sentences long. That they say NIH applicants describe how, in the long or short term, research contributes to fundamental knowledge about the nature or behavior of living things, or the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, reduce illness and disability. Um, this is these are basically they were instituted, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, and it's because NIH has to report to Congress to justify the NIH budget. They do that by highlighting, really important work that they're funding. It's to, like, if you're doing very, very basic science stuff, by adding the public health relevance, it's pointing out why we care about that basic science project. Um, have you ever heard of the Golden Fleece Award?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so I can always tell when I'm getting old. So this is something that was a really big deal in the 70s and 80s. There was a senator called William Proxmire, and he was all into waste, fraud, and abuse. And there's all this waste, fraud, and abuse about federal funding of research. So he would basically, and this was even before public databases or the internet, he would send his congressional staffers out to read um, the research descriptions for grants, and the ones that sounded silly or ridiculous, he would make them public and call them that they were Golden Fleece Awards, that basically researchers are fleecing the taxpayer. And this actually got shot down when he went after somebody doing pain research on, I forget what the model was, but it was like, and that one, and he actually got sued for this by the investigator, and the investigator was able to show why it was very NIH relevant, but the research description that was public didn't sound like it. So NIH instituted this so that NIH staffers who are putting together these congressional reports can really highlight why the research we're doing is important. So, and this is particularly important for basic scientists. Now, they're generally pretty easy to write. Again, you don't need to sweat them so much, but again, I think you're going to have a pretty easy time writing this. It's not like your research is very obviously public health relevant. So now the next piece is actually one of the two critical pieces if you actually want to get your research funded. And this is the specific aims page. Now, one thing that is not clear from the NIH directions is that you should consider the specific aims page as the technical abstract of your grant. Many, many of the decision makers who are making, and the reason that people tend to emphasize and focus on the specific aims page so much is that many of the decision makers who are making real world decisions about whether your grant is being funded will only be reading the specific aims page. They're making important decisions and they're not reading the research proposal part. They're only looking at the specific aims page. So reading that in such a way so that it is crystal clear from a whole host of people with technical backgrounds, but maybe not technical backgrounds in your field is really, really important. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the audience of the specific aims page is mostly internal to NIH. It is never publicly posted. That said, it is the document that decisions are made on. And this is from the second your proposal hits the front door of NIH. Like when you push that submit button, the specific aims page is the most important thing that's read. Now, the first thing is the specific aims page is what's used to make study section assignments. So when your proposal hits the door of the NIH, there's two assignments that happen. One is that it's assigned to an institute. Like in your case, you want your grant submitted to NIDA. Mm-hmm. It also gets submitted to a study section. Now, most K awards, but not all, are reviewed by an organization called the Center for Scientific Review. It's actually an organization that's separate and independent from the Institute. And it's not at all unusual for the Center for Scientific Review. They basically almost pool grants in similar scientific areas that may be assigned to different institutes. So this is used for the assignment to the institute as well as assignment to the study section. Now, there are some Ks that are not reviewed by the Center for Scientific Review. They're reviewed internally by the institute. And that's something that you probably should send an email to the program officer of the K program at NIDA and ask them, are these going to be reviewed in-house at NIDA or through the Center for Scientific Review? Because that can change a little bit about how you're going to want to write your specific aims page, because the audience reading it might be a little bit different. That makes sense?
Yeah. So would it would go to both if it was going to, I would either just go to NIDA or go to NIDA and the Center for Scientific Review?
Okay, so this isn't something you really get a choice on. This is just a policy thing internally to them. So something on the order of 80 to 90% of proposals coming to NIH are reviewed by the Center for Scientific Review.
Okay.
So, and those are, like, if you ever heard of standing study sections, or it's basically an office that bundles grants together. So just as for instance, cancer research. Cancer research can be funded by the National Cancer Institute, but it can also be funded by the National Eye Institute. It's an ocular cancer, or NIDDK if it's a kidney cancer, and so forth and so on. But the study sections are grouped by scientific expertise. So actually, another really great example is diabetes research. So diabetes research can be funded by I just drew a blank on the name of the institute, but there's a Institute for Diabetes. But there's also a lot of organ-specific diseases that are related to diabetes. So that a diabetes grant is going to be reviewed by a study section specializing in diabetes, but it might be assigned to the institutes that are handling the specific organ system that's affected here. So it allows for a different kind of grouping of grants and how they're reviewed.
Okay.
Okay. So now that when you submit your application, there's a place where you can request a funding institute, and you can also request a specific study section. Now, again, for K awards, they typically don't go to regular standing study sections. Those are usually for R awards. So that's sort of why it's important to know how Ks are reviewed at NIDA. Now, I said that 80% or so of grants that come in are reviewed by Center for Scientific Review. That grants, like let's say you were submitting an R award in the topic that you're planning. That R award may go to a study section focusing on healthcare economics. So your grant's going there, a grant on the economics of certain kinds of prenatal screening, and another grant on another kind of economic question. They all may go there. But because this is a K, it might not go to a study section like that. Instead, it might go to a study section where the person works for NIDA, and they then set up the study section ad hoc, looking for experts in the type of topics that the applicants have submitted. So it's a very different set of expertise that might get chosen to review the grant if it's reviewed internally by NIDA versus being reviewed by a study section through Center for Scientific Review. Okay. So that's just kind of an important thing to know. Now, but you can request these things. Now, what'll happen is that you can make these requests. When your grant enters the Center for Scientific Review, if you've made requests and they read your grant and there seems to be a good match, they will just assign based on your requests. that may change later when other people who are more knowledgeable read your grant. But that's the first thing that has to happen is it comes in the door, it needs a institute, and it needs a review process.
Okay.
Now, the other thing, audiences that will read this are the scientific review officer. So if it goes to the Center for Scientific Review, that's the person who handles the review process. They assign the reviewers, they organize the meeting, they handle the whole review, and they are the ones that develop the summary statement, which is the description of how the review went. It also goes to the program officers. These are the people who make the primary funding recommendations. So they get all of these summary statements and they decide which grants, well, that they're going to recommend for funding and which ones they won't. That it also goes and is read by by all the study section members. When I give the presentation on how grants are reviewed and scored, this might make more sense, but it's not at all unusual for a study section to maybe have 20 or 30 members. And those 20 or 30 members, only 3 of them will read your entire grant. However, let's say all 17 other members will score your grant, even though they didn't read the whole thing. And they're going to be largely scoring it based on the opinion of the 3 people who read your grant in depth. And the only piece of your grant that those other 17 study section members are usually going to be reading is your specific aims page. So that's another reason why it's really important is that even a lot of the scoring is going to be based on an opinion given by just reading the specific aims page and not the grant. Also, other NIH administrative staff get this, as well as a group of people called the Board of Scientific Counselors. All NIH grants are actually reviewed twice. They're reviewed by study section, and then the grants that are basically recommended for funding by the program officer are also reviewed by the Board of Scientific Counselors. And that's a group of extremely senior people in the field who are basically, very often it's like a rubber stamp, but they will look through all the grants that are scored. And if there's a grant in an area that's underfunded or in an area that's really important and underemphasized, they may, by just reading the specific aims page, say, well, this grant should probably be considered for funding. So it's, again, another group of very important decision makers who are only reading aims pages and not research proposals. Okay. Does that make some sense? So the specific aims page, I guess the critical thing I'm trying to get at is the specific aims page should be able to stand completely on its own in significance and impact and in a general description of what you are doing. It is the technical abstract, and it sets up the scientific problem. It should let us know what questions you plan to answer, your hypothesis, a set of objectives, as well as an impact statement. And I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so this is that technical abstract, and I already talked about who is going to be reading it.
Okay, for specific aims for something like a K, where a large part of what you're writing is a career development training plan, is that included in the specific aims, or is that just the research questions?
Well, generally the specific aims of a K are just the research questions, but keep in mind that one of the criteria of a K is training potential. So that it would be good under the specific aims to point out not just what the science is going to be, but how doing that is going to be training you. Okay. So you can, but the research plan and the specific aims are usually more focused to the actual research than get my cat out of here. So like you might say that my aim is to I think you were saying the cost of this review process is that, or this getting people seen the next day, is that cost effective? It's, in a K, it's not just about, are you going to get that answer? It's also the training you're going to get during the process to make you a better independent investigator, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can point that out under that aim. But it's that way it's easy. It's also easier even for the reviewer to understand the training potential of the application. But it needs to be completely freestanding. Assume the reader of a specific aims page has no access to the grant body. Now, it's the first paragraph I usually recommend is clearly describing the scientific problem and its significance so that the reader can completely and immediately understand who cares. Like your description you gave me was very, very good. It was something that I don't do anything related to what you do, but I can understand why I should care about you doing this and getting this. So in that first paragraph, you need to make that abundantly clear. You want the person reading that first paragraph to be very excited about this being an important problem, that there is a knowledge gap, and that answering that very important problem is something we really need to have happen. So it's that who cares that has to come out crystal clear. And realize that you can't nerd that out. It has to be something that is clear to kind of a non-technical's wrong, but somebody who is not deeply enmeshed in your world will understand why it's important.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the specific aims proper, those are your 2 to 4 objectives or problems that the research is intended to accomplish and solve. For Ks, 2 aims is usually fine. Kind of the standard grant is 3. But to be honest, I have 2 R awards, and both of my R awards have 2 aims. It's okay to write only 2 aims. That writing more than 3 is kind of more standard. Writing 4 gets to be quite a bit much, and usually if you're writing 4 aims, you should probably be thinking about collapsing it down to 2 or 3. Usually, but specific aims can have sub-aims, so it's not just like one objective necessarily. Sometimes you have a big picture objective and then you have sub-aims there. Now, personally, I don't put a lot of experimental detail in my aims on my aims page. I more use that space to sell the why I care about that aim. It would be great if you could get that proposal bank that Erin was talking about, because you will see that different people write their aims in different styles. Personally, I don't put a lot of experimental detail, but what I say is that I have this objective, so the aim is to test a particular hypothesis or have a particular objective. And then underneath is where I justify that I have this preliminary information we have this problem, and I really need to solve it for these reasons. Now, I would definitely see if you could work in the hypothesis word, if you can. Your research is a little bit different than the kind of stuff that I'm more familiar with, so definitely talk to your advisors there who are used to writing this kind of economic analysis thing. But I think in your case, you have a hypothesis, right? The hypothesis is that it's cost-effective way to deliver care is by doing this particular approach, and that and you're basically doing the analysis to test that hypothesis. And it's good if you can explicitly state that you have a hypothesis. That sort of makes some sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Reviewers like hypothesis-driven research. They don't like open-ended things. Oh, I'm going to do this and let's see what happens. Mm-hmm. And in your case, I think you have a reasonably easy to state hypothesis. And don't be afraid of using the H word. I know sometimes people feel pretentious when they use the word hypothesis. but that reviewers typically like hypothesis-driven projects. And if you tell them this is my hypothesis, it's easier for them to see immediately that you do have a hypothesis. Now, generally, I tend to state the aims for my work as a hypothesis to be solved. So if you have two aims, maybe one will be, to test the hypothesis that maybe this referral process is effective in a health standpoint. Like maybe there's better outcomes, maybe people are doing better clinically, and then your other aim might be the cost side of it. And those are, again, both two easily stated hypotheses. Mm-hmm. So you could say aim one will be to test this hypothesis, and aim two will be test that hypothesis. Or the other way people write it is aim one might be to determine or to do a certain kind of economic analysis on this situation. And then you could say in the little wording under it, hypothesis, this particular intervention is cost effective to the healthcare community or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Now, one thing I would probably suggest to you, especially since you're doing a cost effectiveness type of research, is that you do figure out who your program officer would be for this K, and see if you could get a phone call with them, or if you go to a conference in this area, a lot of times program officers go to conferences and are willing to talk to you then. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that I know that for some federally funded healthcare research, they are banned from talking about cost effectiveness. I believe that's true for, I just drew up. Aaron, do you remember what's the name of the comparative of the
PCORI?
of that? Yeah, PCORI. PCORI can't fund cost effectiveness in research. They can only fund research on whether something is clinically effective or not. Like they can do research on health outcomes, but in their charter they're banned from doing cost effectiveness research. And I don't know if there's any political things related to NIH on that. And where this came from is PCORI came out of the Obamacare when that was passed, and there was a lot of people who were really worried that if you could show certain treatments are cheaper, that people would get less care. And this was there was a lot of political maneuvering there. And so that's why it's in PCORI's charter. They can't actually fund cost effectiveness research, just health effectiveness research.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's just something I don't know about how NIH looks at it, but I think it's a question that you should ask just to make sure you don't put all this effort into something that you're going to get some pushback from.
Sure. Yeah, I never even considered that would be a problem, but I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the political. I mean, you know that how the U.S. government and everything thinks about the politics of healthcare and paying for healthcare and stuff. It's just a very fraught topic, and PCORI was set up because there were people who were so scared about asking that question that they were banned from doing that kind of research. But PCORI could be a place where your work could fit if you were only focused on the health outcomes to the patients you're serving. Okay. Now, some other things is that, again, I typically err on the side of avoiding in-depth technical descriptions. And the reason, there's an article, I sent Erin a bunch of articles this morning, and she'll send them to you guys. That are kind of like grant writing tips, some really nice articles. One of my favorites is your grant, the rejected recipe or the funded menu. And this is basically the difference between comparing a cooked food item to a stack of recipes. So a description of a cooked food item, you're going to buy it, but you might not if you're only presented with the recipe for a baked chicken, you might not want to buy that baked chicken, but a really nice description of the baked chicken you would buy. And it kind of is the idea is that if you nerd out too much on technical descriptions, you're going to have the people who are decision makers maybe tune out. They're not going to necessarily see the significance of using this particular, let's say, economic analysis tool, but they can see the importance of your objective. So you give them enough information to get a general idea, but like an example is that, like in my world, I might say that we want to determine, gene expression in a certain way, but you don't want to put the detailed description of the Western blot, you would do it. So it's the big picture objective is the focus on, and less on the absolute technical detail on an Ames page. You're going to have to put all that in your research description, but it can be counterproductive on an Ames page. Now, one thing is that this might be less of a problem for you, but it's not at all unusual for people to put a lot of effort into an Ames page and then to write the research plan. And as you write the research plan, you're usually doing a lot more in-depth reading, a lot more in-depth focus, and that you end up with good experiments that will give good information, but that in the end, the experiments in the research plan aren't actually testing the hypothesis that you have laid out in your specific Ames page. And so very often people will tell you to write your Ames page, then work on your research plan, which is fine, but just at the end, maybe a week or two before submission, you have your research plan largely done. Make sure that the Ames page still is appropriately reflecting what you are doing in your grant. Because it's easy for those two documents to diverge from each other, I guess is a good way to put it, because they're written at different times often. Okay.
Sure, yeah.
And very often, then people will ask, like if you talk to a program officer, very often they'll say, oh, send me your Ames page. And that's another place where, or if you're trying to shop a proposal to an institute, program officers will say, send me your Ames page and I'll see, how your work fits. Or maybe, like if you're asking them to suggest a study section, they'll also say, send me your Ames page. But this will be well before you have fleshed out the rest of your proposal. Now, the other piece that I always recommend to people, save space at the bottom of the Ames page for an impact statement. And so the actual score you get on an NIH grant, it's called the impact score. And it's for a reason, is that the reviewers, push comes to shove, are asked to say, if this work is funded, is it going to move the field forward? And that's the only criteria for an R award. And for a K award, is it going to result in a well-trained investigator able to move the field forward? So that it sometimes isn't, keep in mind you're spending months or years on this project. Your reviewer is going to spend at most 3 or 4 hours, and probably less than that with your project. So you can't expect the reviewer to be able to come up with all of the things that are important in your work, I guess. Like they might not understand why this work will in fact be important to the field. It might not just be immediately obvious to them. So you're better off by telling them. So tell them why this is important. What is the big picture impact? And for a K, there could be that big picture impact of, if you show that this helps outcomes on people and it's cost effective, that this could change standard of care or change how emergency departments deal with this nationally, because you'll be able to write this up, show that this is a really important best practice, while at the same time it's also training a enthusiastic early career doctor to really look for ways to help improve care of the patients that are seen in emergency departments. So that could be the impact statement. But by stating this explicitly, because one thing is that if you can't come up with the impact of the work on the field, that you can't expect the reviewer to. So if you can be the one who thinks about it all day, who can tell the reviewer why this is so incredibly important, that gives you a leg up over somebody who leaves that impact statement blank. Maybe the reviewer won't see why it's important right away, but you can tell them why it's important. And that's the score driver. Now, the things to keep in mind about impact, is the project important? That's significance. Is the approach likely to be successful? Is the investigator capable of doing it? And is the research environment the right research environment for doing the project? So all of those things together are bundled together into the final score of the grant, that is the impact score. Now, in your case, you're just basically saying that this work desperately needs to be done, and if it is done, it's going to maybe change the paradigm in the field, change clinical care, change hospital practices, whatever that is going to be in your case. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and I copied down exactly what you said for the impact, so.
Okay, cool. It's a grantsmanship thing. It's not a requirement in NIH guidelines, but it's definitely a grantsmanship thing. Now, you're going to be writing impact. I would recommend you write impact throughout the rest of the proposal. So I'll talk now about the research plan. So the research plan, this is what you're going to be ending up spending your most time and effort and energy on. In some ways, the sort of the depressing side of that is only going to ever be read by 3 people who count. That generally the program officers do not read your entire research plan. Sometimes they might if they want clarification, but now this could be skimmed by others if they want clarification of something that was explained on the Ames page, but really only those 3 assigned reviewers are going to be the ones reviewing it in depth. Now, format for a K, it's a lot shorter than 12 pages. I don't remember how long it is. Is it like 4 or 6? Did you get a chance?
Yeah, the other ones I've looked at have been like 3 to 4, I think.
Okay, yeah, that might be right. So so this is actually for an R01 grant. The research plan is 12 pages, and it's separated into significance, innovation, and approach, which I believe is also true for the research plan of a K. At least it was the last time I looked at it. It's just going to be, everything's going to be shorter, which makes sense. I mean, you're not going to be proposing the scope of work in a K that you do in an R. Now, this is the meat of the proposal. You have to, why anybody should care and how the work moves the field forward. Now the significance, this is the opportunity to elaborate on that big picture scientific question. It's the intro to the field. Now, that this is the why it can be helpful if this is going to be reviewed by what's called a standing study section. So there's 2 different flavors of how reviews are done, and it's all done by peer review. There are study sections that are called standing study sections. These are cases where senior scientists in the field are appointed to those. They serve for 5 years, so that if your grant is assigned to one of those, you can actually look that person up and you know what their scientific expertise is and you know what they're interested in. So that can help you write the grant because you can then envision your audience. Now, a lot of training grants like Ks and I know F awards are reviewed typically by ad hoc study sections. In other words, the person who's in charge of the review sees what grants come into the study section, and then they will build their panel around the expertise needed to review those grants. And I just don't know how that is for Ks for NIDA. So that's a question worth asking. Um, now this is a case that you want to put yourself, though, you should be envisioning writing to a particular reviewer. Don't envision your collaborators, don't envision your mentors. Envision the type of people. So in this case, it might be people who are expert in the economics of drug disorders or drug use disorders. Or it could be, you might get somebody who's actually an expert in alcohol, not opiates. Or you might get somebody who's a healthcare economist that is expert in other things. Or you could get experts in clinical care of people who are involved in treating people with opiate issues. And so you need to think about, for that group of audiences, what would convince them that this work is important and really needs to be done. Now, there's different ways that people write this. Some people put the significance for everything being done in the significance section. I personally don't do that. I use my significance section for the big picture significance. And then I put the significance of each aim in the aim. So when I start talking about the approach, I explain the significance of why I'm doing it in that aim. And the reason is that it's not at all unusual for grants to be that people are doing this as extra work. So they usually don't have 3 or 4 hours at a sitting to review your grant. They're basically, they might, read your aims page, and then they'll go off and teach or see patients, and then they'll read the significance section, and then they get pulled away by their crying baby, and then they'll read your aims. So what can happen is that you put all this background and preliminary information into the significance section, and the reviewer will forget it by the time they read your aim. So that's why I tend to use the significance to be big picture question, big picture literature, laying out the major knowledge gap here that you're proposing to fill. And then the stuff that really justifies this experimental approach or why you're using a particular analytical technique, I put that into the actual approach section so that the reviewer's not having to do mental gymnastics remembering what you wrote. Now, this length of one page, that is really set up for an R01 grant. This might be a little bit shorter, maybe down to a half a page in your grant, because you only have the 4 pages total. Now, this is the significance section is that this will convince the reader the area is important and there are critical knowledge gaps. Now, there is a review criteria now called the scientific premise. The scientific premise is essentially the literature. Does the literature and preliminary data essentially justify what you're doing? And that they ask the reviewers to address, is the scientific premise strong? In other words, did you adequately review the literature? If there's controversies, like maybe some people find that there's literature suggesting under certain scenarios that the kind of thing that you're doing is not cost effective, while in other scenarios that it can be cost effective. They expect you to analyze, okay, this is what the literature says on this, that, why that by, in the cases where, where's the controversy, to explicitly say there's this controversy in this area that that it could result from, maybe it's a different kind of hospital, maybe a community hospital versus a large academic medical center have different things going on. So whether this is a good approach or not could change. That you should lay out the literature on this, the controversies, and leading up to pointing out where the knowledge gap is in the field, and that your goal is to fill this critical knowledge gap. Okay, does that kind of make sense?
Yep.
That's cool. All right, so now there's also a section called innovation. Innovation is what they call the scorable criteria. And I'll go through scoring in great detail in another class, but there's 5 what are called criterion scores, which are basically the reviewer is asked to say, on a scale of 1 to 9, is this like a really good thing or a really bad thing? And the criteria are innovation, approach, environment, investigator, innovation, approach, environment, investigator, and there's another one that I just drew a blank on. Forget what the 5th one is, but they really are asking, is it innovative or is it just using tired old hackneyed techniques to address this problem? So that it's not something to completely flake out about, because that's the final score that matters is that impact score, which is the overall score. And it turns out the different scorable criteria do not affect that final score equally. And in fact, that the approach score correlates very strongly with the final impact score. That said, the better scores you get on everything, the better. And this is almost the cool factor. Did the reviewer read this and say, wow, that's a really interesting way of looking at this problem. They're using state-of-the-art cutting-edge techniques that have not ever been used in this system, or they've developed a new state-of-the-art cutting-edge technique. So like in something like maybe this is a very innovative program that maybe you're going to be analyzing using economics methods that have never been used to this problem. That could be innovative. It's innovative to this area.
Mm-hmm.
So for innovation, it tends to be explaining how the applicant challenges and seeks to shift current research or clinical practice paradigms, any novel theoretical concepts, and any refinements, improvements. Now, the application usually doesn't specify a length for innovation. I typically confine this to 4 to 6 sentences because you want to spend most of your, you want to explain how what you're doing is innovative, but you have to give the detail to sell that in your main part of your approach. Right, so then there's the approach section. So this is what you are going to do. Now, the way the NIH describes this, it seems like this is the bare bones, I'm going to do this. But for good grantsmanship, most people don't write them this way. Just by giving a bare bones description of what you're doing isn't really an effective way to write the approach section. So usually the format is that there might be like a 1 paragraph long intro to the approach section that is basically restating, that this is a significant thing going out to a big knowledge gap. Then you would state your specific aim. So you could say specific aim 1 is to test the hypothesis, blah, 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 blah. Or if specific aim 1 is to determine whether intervention is cost effective, your hypothesis is this intervention is cost effective. I then will give the background and preliminary data supporting that hypothesis. So I typically don't front load a lot of the aim specific background and preliminary data in that significance section. I tend to put it in the approach section. And that is basically justifying the hypothesis. You can explain what experiments, or in your case, analyses will be done to test that hypothesis. If you're going to do multiple like let's say if there's multiple economic models, I know nothing about the kind of stuff you do, but let's say you'd want to use 2 or 3 different economic models to see whether this is important, you could call those different sub-aims. So if your aim is to test the economics, but you want to use 3 different approaches to get at that number, you could have sub aim 1.1 is to use this approach to test that, sub aim 1.2, sub aim 1.3. Now, at the end of each sub aim, you want to give the pitfalls and alternate approaches. So, like there might be, the reason you might want to do 3 economic models is that each economic model has limitations. You want to explicitly tell the reviewer that you know that this model has these has these limitations. Maybe there's data missing or something. If that happens, what alternate approach are you going to use to get at the same question? Or maybe you're only going to use one economic model, but it has limitations. You should say, if these limitations show up so we don't get the answer we're trying to get, we will maybe use these other economic modeling systems as alternate approaches to get at the question if the first approach doesn't work for you. That's a really important thing in an aim, is that you want to be the one telling the reviewer you completely understand the strengths and weaknesses of your methodologies, and that since you're aware of those weaknesses, if they turn out to be a problem, you know how to overcome those weaknesses. And that's really important, particularly for new investigators. They're not going to assume that you know that a certain method has some problems with it, because all methods have problems, none are perfect. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then you want to explicitly describe what the data will look like if the hypothesis is supported or if the hypothesis is rejected. And then how will you move forward in the work if the hypothesis is rejected? So that in this particular case, if the hypothesis that this is in fact saves money is rejected, well, what would be the next steps under those situations? But you should tell the reviewer what the data will look like if it's supported as well. Now, one thing is you want to avoid what people call dependent aims. So there's this very, very strong tendency, everybody has it, where you might say you propose 3 aims as 3 different subsets of a project. So maybe aim 1 will be to collect sample, like to do an intervention. Aim 2 might be to do the like aim 1 might be to develop an intervention. Aim 2 might be to test certain parameters of how that intervention was working, and aim 3 might be the economics of it, I'll say. If aim 1 fails, though, if the intervention doesn't work in the first place, aim 2 and 3 are then completely useless and shouldn't be done. Mm-hmm. So that's what's called dependent aims. So usually you want your aims to be parallel with each other, not dependent. Like you don't want the success of being able to do aim 2 dependent on the success of aim 1. So so this is so just avoid that. You want your aims to be parallel things. Now, the length of the approach is usually not specifically given. For a R award, that essentially there are 12 pages. I usually say 10 to 11 for my approach section. For your K award, let's say it's a 4-page proposal, I would probably say at least 3 for the approach. And then you could have 1 page, let's say, for the significance and the innovation section. Now, you want to explicitly explain how the results obtained prove or disprove the hypothesis, and you need to be objective and critical. Things that people get in trouble with is correlation versus causation. You don't want to overinterpret what the experiment will tell you. And you also want to make really, really sure that what you're doing will actually address the hypothesis you're asking. It's not at all unusual to have this beautiful hypothesis, but the experiments not actually address the hypothesis. And So that's a kind of a big piece here. Now, you should also think of this as, you should also step back a little bit and think about how you're going to publish this, because they want this work to not just be an answer for, let's say, institutionalization with the state. For if you want this funded by NIH, they want to see you writing this up and disseminating it into the scientific community. So you should think about, if this work works, how would that be packaged into a publication? Did I propose to do everything necessary to get this work published? So that can be a very helpful thing to think about when developing approaches. This one doesn't really apply to you because I don't think you're going to have any reagents involved. But
No.
but if you did, you have to basically show that your reagents are valid for that you're using the reagents you think you're using. So for anybody who's listening to this as a recording, for instance, if you're using a cell line, you have to explain how you're going to prove that it is a particular cell line and not contamination from another cell line, which is a very common problem. Okay, so that if the project is in the early stages of development, you want to describe strategies for determining feasibility. How are you managing high risk aspects of the work? Now, this again doesn't probably affect you, but procedures, situations, materials that can be hazardous to personnel, you need to again talk about that explicitly. Now, personally, this is again a grantsmanship thing. I tend to put my pitfalls at the end of each sub-aim. So if you have, let's say, a 2-aim grant with 3 sub-aims, you want to put the pitfalls and alternate approaches in each sub-aim. Don't save that to the end of the aim. A lot of people tend to do that. But that can be problematic because, one, the reviewer's looking for that information. And if they're waiting a while to see it, they can kind of be annoyed. Also, it often doesn't fit as well in flow. So it's, if you just say, I did this experiment or did this approach, this is the expected outcomes, this is the pitfalls of the approach, and how I'm going to deal with them. Second sub-aim, break it up that way as well. And just don't have the reviewer waiting to the very end of the aim. That's just a kind of a grantsmanship suggestion. Now, I personally recommend that each aim has a explicit impact statement. There's a couple reasons for this. One is that you have to put this pitfalls alternate approaches section. It's really easy for the last thing the reviewer to read is a pitfall or a reason that it's not going to work, which is just bad emotionally and intellectually. So if the last thing they read in your aim is the impact, in other words, why is this important? Why is this going to be important? Then they're like, oh, they are going to do this. They're going to answer this question. They're going to do it this way. This is what the data is going to look like. That they completely understand the pitfalls, and then they just reminded me why I care and why is it important. It's just better, it's better kind of emotionally and psychologically to have that impact right up front at the end of each aim, instead of them ending on a pitfall or a reason it doesn't work. Then also, I typically have at the end of the second aim, you have that impact statement. And then the last thing you want the reviewer to read when they're reading your approach section is an explicit description of the impact, so that they are again reminded why this work is so important and why it needs to be done. Again, reviewers are distracted between the teaching, the seeing the patient in clinic, the crying baby, whatever is distracting them. You want to make sure they don't lose the thread of why they should care, because high scores on grants are because the reviewer got excited about the potential of the project, and you want to be telling them why they should be so excited. Okay. All right. So this final thought slide is a lot of the descriptions are based on R01. So an R01 is 12 pages. Um, that, a lot of people are like, think that's a very long proposal. When you get into it, though, you'll realize it's short. One thing and you're writing an even shorter proposal. One thing that is sometimes frustrating is that you'll get your grant reviewed and the reviewers will come back and ask you for more information and you're like, how can I possibly fit that in there? I only had 4 pages. Don't write to 4 pages when you're writing this. Write the approach section in its first draft as long as it needs to be. And you may find it needs to be 5, 6, 7 pages long to get all of your thoughts in, all of the description in, all the significance in that you think is needed for that hypothetical reviewer to be reading your grant. However, then you edit it later. And what this does is that most writers just tend to be verbose. There's like a lot of, it has been shown that, or it has been demonstrated that, when you can just say, this is a fact. And there's a lot of places where also typically writers tend to say the same things over and over again, just saying it different ways. So that if you write to a 4-page limit, you're not going to be putting everything down on paper that needs to be in the final grant. But for most people, it's reasonably easy to take you've written 7 pages, easy to edit it down to 5 and towards 4. And then you can word craft down by just changing the way you say things to get it down to the 4 pages, which is the requirement. If you write to the 4-page limit, you're going to actually not be putting in all the information that the reviewer is going to be asking you for. That you kind of see where I'm going here? It's just a writing philosophy.
Yeah.
And I write with graduate students all the time, and that, like, if you're writing an abstract for a conference, they write the thing, and I said, well, why didn't you put that in? Why didn't you put in that? Why did you put in that in? It's only a 250-word abstract, and it's like, write it as 1,000 words, get everything down on paper, and then we will cut it. And I almost never have trouble cutting the abstract down by just removing a lot of excess verbiage. But don't freak yourself out when you're writing. Just free form, get all your thoughts down on paper and edit later. It's way easier to edit than it is to write de novo. So if you are trying to edit, making it look like the final form while you're writing, you can actually get writer's block from that. But don't reference when you write your first draft. Don't worry about spelling, punctuation, grammar. Just get all your thoughts down on paper and then put in all that other stuff later. All right, and there's actually a kind of a cute article in one of the articles that I sent Erin to send you. It's called Polishing Your Prose by it's called Polishing Your Prose something, but it basically takes a 1-page piece of writing and word crafts it down to 2 sentences. And they show that they actually removed no real content. I think it's like a physics article or something, but it gives a lot of examples of how what seems like to be important writing wasn't. So that's why, just get all your thoughts down and then word craft it later. Really, it does work pretty well. And I think that's it. So I don't know if this helped at all, but this is sort of some philosophical things about grants.
Yeah, no, that was really helpful to even go over the sections and kind of get an idea of who's reading what, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I said, I started to try to write some of it, and it's hard to, I don't know, I feel like when you first do anything, it's hard to figure out what's going on. But having some direction with it is really helpful, so I appreciate you giving the talk.
Well, and actually, one other thing that could be helpful is that, I'm sure you're doing literature searches and stuff. that as you get an idea what the literature looks like, figure out who the principal investigators are for those projects,
Mm-hmm.
and then envision you're writing your grant to them,
Mm-hmm.
especially the approach section, because the people who are publishing in this area are likely going to be the people who are going to be um, basically approached to review your grant.
Mm-hmm.
And this, it can often help a lot to be writing to a hypothetical audience instead of, because then you kind of think of, oh, they're going to want to hear this from me. Oh, they might know this economic thing, but they might not know this issue with drug abuse treatment, or so that you need to be empathizing with the potential writer and try to get into their head. So you're not writing it to you, you're not writing it to your mentor, you're writing it to this hypothetical reviewer. And having a profile of what that person would be and what they know can be very helpful. So that helps you, know what you need to be telling them so that they can think the work is kind of important.
Sure.
Okay. So do you have any other questions or anything for today?